Have you ever had those moments where you do anything to get away? Life has hit you hard and you need a break. You need to stop looking at everyone, take a few moments to process, to grow, maybe even mourn. Whatever the case may be, chapter 14 starts with the story of the death of John the Baptist. The story's hard to read, and we realize the power of sin and guilt. Because John was jailed initially as a way to be silenced for speaking out against Herod and his wife Herodias' marriage. So she was related to him, and he was also his brother's wife first. So John, on more than one occasion, had spoken out against them. And it bothered Herod, but it enraged Herodias. So in a way to settle her down and silence John, Herod had him arrested. But that wasn't sufficient for Herodias, who sent her teenage daughter to Herod's birthday party to dance for Herod and his guests, essentially. And Herod was so pleased that he offered her anything she wanted. But her mother told her precisely what to ask for, and that was John's head on a platter. Herod has this internal struggle, knowing that this is not the right decision, but is pressured into the action anyways. Isn't that just like sin, isn't it? It takes you further than you want and keeps you longer than you ever intended. Scripture says in verse 13, now when word reaches Jesus about what had happened to John, you can sense the pain that he felt in the totality of the verse. Now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people had heard about this, they followed him on foot from the cities. It says in verse 13. I want to jump forward to Luke chapter 1, where we read of the foretelling of the births of John and Jesus. So Zechariah and Elizabeth, John's parents, are related to Mary, meaning that Jesus and John are relatives. Now, you have to remember how close these two are. Also, when Mary gets the news about this supernatural pregnancy, where does she go? Elizabeth and Zechariah's house. So they're close. And we see from the scriptures in Luke chapter 1 that the prophecies show how these two futures are connected. One will be the Messiah and the other will be a prophet preparing the way for the Messiah. We've already read this account in Matthew chapter 3 at Jesus' baptism of the connection and the love that these two have for each other. Now, when this news hits Jesus, he's immediately moved to get away and find some solitude, which is really a common practice of his. We see in Mark 1, in Mark 6, and Luke 5, Luke 6, Luke 9, Luke 22, and even in Hebrews 5, that shows that Jesus often went out alone to pray. We've been there. I've been there recently when we have these rough moments and you just want to get away from it all. But as we continue through the story, we see that those who wanted a touch from him or to learn from him, they discovered where he was going and he actually beat him there on foot. But instead of being frustrated or asking them to leave or ignoring them, just walking on by, Scripture says that he had compassion on them and he healed their sick. I find this moment challenging because he's looking for solitude in his dark moment, yet he looks compassionately at the needs around him. So how often we come across those needs when we don't feel like it, and even justified wanting to be left alone or walk by or ignore a text because we just don't feel like it. But I see Jesus' love for people come through, even in his grieving, and it's a trait that we as Jesus' followers should have too. This chapter goes on and we see Jesus continue to care for people and move with compassion in moments he didn't have to. Look at the feeding the 5,000. The disciples all say, send them away. It's not our problem. It's not our job. Don't worry about it. But Jesus, moved by compassion, again looks outside of himself and his team, and he says, we can do something about this. So this week, let's look for ways to be compassionate. Even when we don't feel like it or we don't have to, even when it's not our problem. Now, we're going to save more of the feeding the 5,000 for later, since it's in all four of those Gospels. But this week, be motivated look for opportunities to be compassionate and to be moved by that nature of Jesus that we see displayed in this chapter.